Do you all know who Nancy Brous is? Ever heard of Nancy Brous? Neither had I. But I know her now. Well, I know about her now. She's a co-owner for a bookstore in Brattleboro, Vermont, called Everyone's Books. She has been an environmental and peace activist for decades, as well as a volunteer for Bernie and other progressive candidates. Sounds a lot like our contributor to this program, Jude, doesn't it? But this woman is named Nancy Brous, and she lives in Brattleboro, Vermont. Well, she wrote a piece for, I think I got this at Common Dreams. Is that right? I think I did. And I want to share with you what she wrote, because here's one more voice who is trying to raise the alarm of the incipient fascism that is engulfing this country, the United States. She starts out by saying, every week we witness a new, sometimes hidden or subtle, sometimes very blatant step toward normalizing violence as the solution to political problems. The Republican Party is taking the late 1920s, 1930s strategy of the Nazi Party in Germany and using this model of bringing fascism to our door and manipulating voting so it will appear to be an elected choice. Huh? We've had so many historical examples of this, folks. Now, I know a lot of them occurred before most of the people, if not all the people who listen to this program, were even born. I get that. I mean, in the 1920s, Jesus, if somebody had been around in the 1920s and still around listening to this program, they wouldn't be able to hear it anyway, right? No offense to us old people, but you know what I'm saying. So the clues, the obvious, and they're not even clues, the open activities of the American fascists are visible if you care to look. And that's the point Nancy Brous is trying to make. She writes, when I visited the Holocaust Museum in D.C. about 10 years ago, I was mesmerized by the portion of the museum dedicated to propaganda that brought the German public into the acceptance phase of a government committed to mass murder of the Jews, communists, the Roma people, and people with disabilities. Also accepted was the notion that the above-named groups were not human. So cruel and painful medical experimentation on these subjects was just fine with the German public. The newspapers and the radio broadcasts moved gradually from vilifying these German citizens, the Jews and the Roma and the communists, to justifying rounding them up in order to purify the German people so that they eventually would be accepting of the final solution. So with a model like this, she writes, how do we interpret the current, ever more hate-filled and violent rhetoric emanating from the Republican Party, which can now be called the white supremacist far right? If I tried to list all the hate speech that has threatened death or bodily injury to people of color, the many acts of racist violence since 2015, the ways in which state-sanctioned violence aimed at left and environmental activists and people of color are proliferating, as in legalizing running down protesters with cars and using water cannons on peaceful protesters at Standing Rock. I could go on and on. But if I tried to list the many acts of racist violence, this essay would be hundreds of pages long. So she asked the question, where is the far right, aka the Republican Party, headed? Well, if we are to believe them, and why should we not? There is a violent confrontation ahead. For those of us who work for racial and social justice, peaceful resolution of conflicts, and that radical notion of teaching our children our true history, This is all potentially going away if Republicans take control of all the branches of government. If we are to believe those who are currently leading the Republican Party, and the vast majority of those who belong to this cult, elections are only legitimate if they win. We are at a point where Donald Trump's absurd and ridiculous whine that he really won in 2020 has taken hold among his minions in a non-reversible way. This creates a real dilemma for the leadership, as most, if not all, know that Trump really lost the numbers count by millions of votes. Now, let me pause there. What Ms. Brous is doing here is laying out her theorem, her theory, which she is now about to verify. But this is something that so many of us have been talking about, either in media, on podcasts, amongst ourselves. I'm sure you've discussed it with people that you are close to. This is a very real situation. I know I keep repeating that, but it's horrifying to think about the consequences of what's going to happen in this country if the Christian Fascist Party, what Nancy Brous and others still refer to as the Republican Party, if they get control of government in 2022, 1 year from now, and especially if they get control of the executive branch in 2024. Again, I think it is screamingly critical that we not let that happen. The Christian fascists are lying and cheating and rigging everything they can get their filthy hands on. So what choice does that leave us? I'm not sure. I have a feeling, I have a thought of the only choice open to us, but I don't want to completely articulate that thought yet. The time may come, though, when I do. Now, back to what Nancy has written. As has been stated by every pundit who is not a member of the far right, the voting restrictions and extreme partisan gerrymandering likely will have the effect of electing ever more extreme House representatives espousing violence, such as Congressman Paul Gosar. The fact that almost no Republicans feel the need to protect a fellow member from armed thugs, such as Gosar, who openly threatened her with death, says loudly and clearly that if they don't get their way, the solution to them is violence. None of the current crop of the far right in the House or Senate has any interest in negotiation, in open communication, or even in any sort of issue debate. It is clear from the direction this cult is taking, as they have told us and showed us with their unequivocal support of the January 6 traitors, that violence and intimidation are the direction they prefer. So what are our solutions? A priority would be call your senators and House representatives today and demand breaking the filibuster in order to pass a strong voting rights law. Joe Manchin promised to get Republicans on board, but he has failed completely. It is now up to the Democrats, right now, before the midterms, because if not now, it will be too late for decades, or maybe forever. We will be opening the door to permanent minority rule, that is, the Christian fascists, and all the insanity and cruelty that the Republicans have been salivating over for the past 5 years. Should we fail, and the current violent white supremacist, anti-Semitic, heteronormative regime of Republicans takes over the House and Senate, it is time to talk secession. Why should we pay taxes to a government that wants us dead? Why should we be part of a country run by deniers of climate destruction when that crisis is upon us? When we see the truly racist and biased so-called judge in the Kyle Rittenhouse case, is this the so-called justice system we crave? If the Republican base can hurl death threats at members of the House for voting in favor of roads and bridges in the infrastructure bill, and yet support the most hateful members wholeheartedly, it is time for us to move on. Before Trump, people sometimes played with the thought exercise of, if you were alive during the rise of Hitler in Germany, what would you have done? Well, whatever that might be, going along to get along or risking your life and livelihood to speak up and resist, you are doing it now. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcast. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.